This is the second installment in the series of taking the keys away. So let me start off by reminding you that senior citizens are overrepresented in fatality statistics. They're more likely to be injured in an accident and more likely to die from that injury simply because they're not as healthy as younger drivers. So the next thing I'd like to mention is kind of how things work in Alabama. Each state has its own rules, but in Alabama, your loved ones are not required to take a driving test in order to renew their license. Now, if a loved one has repeated accidents and the police, get involved, they may request or, require that your loved one take another driving test. But other than that, in Alabama, we just don't have those kinds of rules. So, the next question is, how do you start the conversation about giving up the keys? Ideally, you should start a conversation well before any accidents start happening. You don't want to be in crisis mode when you bring this up to your loved one. So, for example, if your loved one mentions something about a dangerous intersection, then you could just casually mention to them or say something like, well, that really is a dangerous intersection, so why don't we think about another route that you might want to take? That's one way to approach, that portion of it. So another issue is when the weather turns bad. So if the weather is turning bad, you could say that it really isn't the best idea or safe for them to drive in any kind of inclement weather. They will probably agree with you, so that's one thing you can do that sounds, pretty reasonable and easy. Another thing is that you shouldn't have the entire family gang up on your loved one. And someone should play good cop and somebody else should be the bad cop. Now, if you're the only child like I am, then you have to be both good cop and bad cop. So that's really difficult to navigate. I was it became a little bit easier for me to take the keys away from my parents, because little did I know the doctor had already told my mom and my dad that my mother didn't need to drive. And so the only thing I had to do really was to get the keys away from my dad. Well, that became easy once they moved up here to live with me. They didn't know any of the routes. They weren't comfortable driving anywhere here in Birmingham. And so I just by default became the driver. Another thing that you can do is just remember that they're going to be resistant and frustrated at the beginning whenever you start to have that conversation. So the first thing I like to suggest that you do is to validate their concerns, because how would you feel if your adult children tried to tell you that it was time for you to give up your keys? A lot of times, driving has a lot to do with, well, we know it has a lot to do with independence and control, but it also has to do with identity or status. If that's the issue for your loved one, then what you can do is compromise. You could park the car in their front yard so that they feel like, they can look at it and they can see, and neighbors can see that their car is still there, and they won't wonder, well, I wonder why, so and so no longer has a car. Your loved ones are private most of the time, and they don't want to be looked at like they're children or less than. Another suggestion is that you could check out AARP's website. They have a free online seminar called We Need to Talk, and it will help you determine how to assess your loved one's driving skills and provide tools to help you have this very important conversation. So what's next? The next thing is actually making the transition easier for your loved one. You need to have a plan. In your conversation and planning, first try to see if there is a way to keep the person behind the wheel, possibly by making modifications. Maybe they could stop driving at night and avoid freeways or bad weather. Or they could stick to places where they can drive easily and safely, like the post office or their local grocery store or a friend's house or church. Now, you can start driving your parents everywhere they need to go. This can be a catch-22 because if you're the only person who's driving them wherever they have to go, then you pretty much have to plan your life around their schedule. So use that as a last resort if you have to. You can look at alternative transportation options. I know that in Mobile and in Birmingham, the city bus line has a door-to-door service for senior citizens. So that could be an option. And you could also consider Uber for your loved one. What you can do to make the transition easier is also share your fears. Just be honest with them. Tell them, I don't want your last years here on earth to be marred by the fact that you had an accident and hurt yourself or hurt someone else. Typically, anybody can empathize with that kind of statement. So consider that. You could also try asking open-ended questions without sounding like a smart aleck. You could say something like, well, I understand that you still want to drive. So tell me, when do you think you'll be at the point to where you can't drive anymore? That's one suggestion. When you're talking to them, use the word I and we instead of you. You tends to be an accusatory word. So instead of saying, it's really time for you to stop driving because you're starting to have too many accidents, what you could say is, I'm concerned about the minor accidents that you've been having recently. That's less offensive. Another way to make the transition easier is to get creative. Many experts have outlined these suggestions as ways that would be appropriate for you to get the keys away from your loved one. You could disable the vehicle by taking the battery away or disconnecting the battery or disconnecting spark plugs. You could hide their car keys, or you could actually just take them when they're not looking. You can keep the car parked somewhere else, or you could sell the car. This isn't going to be easy, but with time and persistence, hopefully you can get them to give up the keys before they hurt themselves or someone else. Okay, once again, I hope this helps and you take care.